Welcome to Free Kiwis. Today we're very pleased to be joined by Emeritus Professor Roger Openshaw from Massey University. Now, Roger, you are an educational historian. Is that how you describe yourself?
Yes, that's exactly how I describe myself. It's a very small field. We used to say we could hold a conference in a phone booth.
Right, yes.
When we had phone booths.
Well, I think you're the only educational historian I've ever heard of, and certainly the only one whose work I'm a little bit familiar with. What brought you to the field of education? Is your background is as an historian, is that correct? Your PhD?
Yes, it was a thesis that began life in the education department at Waikato, my PhD, and there was a good deal of problems regarding supervisors who ended up fighting each other.
Oh, yes.
And so gradually well, cut a long story short, I became interested in education history. I'd done a master's degree, of course, and in that I looked at school cadets and the growth of school cadets. And in the PhD, I was really interested in the 1920s and 30s when schools were doing what we'd now call imperial patriotism.
Right.
And one of the things that concerned me is when I came out to write up my thesis, the journal editors at the time in education were very much interested in, you might say, what some people in government and in the education department wanted to do. But nobody seemed to ask the question, how successful were they in doing it? And I went on in the second half of my thesis to explain that it didn't really have a great impact, because in those days the main concern was passing the various examinations. So you had to get proficiency if you wanted to go on to secondary education, and later on, of course, matric and all of that. So it was exam orientated, and nobody was going to do much about patriotism, which actually came into some dispute. It just became a very controversial issue in the late 1920s when people began to react against the First World War.
Mm-hmm.
But the editors of the day, who were mainly in education, didn't want to hear about that part. They wanted to hear about what some officials wanted to do for children and patriotism.
So this was the practice the cadets was putting. Was it young men, boys in particular, into quasi-military units within schools? Is that
yes, and again, it didn't work out. It only lasted a short time, because what came in, of course, was physical education.
Right.
And when physical education came in, it was a reaction against the notion of boys marching around. This is just before the First World War.
Right.
And so what my thesis was trying to show in both cases, master's and PhD, was that it's not as simple as it looks. You can't just talk about how some people wanted to make children into sort of patriots. The other question to ask is, how successful were they in doing that? And times move on, and so there are changes. These things became controversial issues. They got contested, and I was interested in that as an historian.
Yeah.
So was your thesis that they were effective at doing that, or not so effective at instilling?
They weren't. It wasn't really effective at all for all sorts of reasons. New Zealand was very much a system of country schools, and a lot of kids actually went to sleep in classes, believe it or not, because they travelled for miles. And I actually found that myself much later when I was teaching. I had children from the country in a place called Kaukopakapa, and they started to fade away about 1 o'clock when they came in, and they actually were asleep. And the reason is that they were up milking.
Yeah, right. Yes.
If you're up there milking at 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning, and then you have a 2-hour bus ride to school, by the afternoon you've had it. You really have. For all sorts of reasons. There were other reasons too. A lot of people weren't happy about teaching patriotism, particularly when there was a reaction against the First World War.
Yes.
1929. Well, All Quiet on the Western Front, the book there. But Also, a lot of New Zealanders were getting concerned at that time, and so it became a controversial issue, and so I wanted to deal with that. So looking at the various changes that would make that less effective in the classroom, really trying to counter the notion that schools were overwhelmingly patriotic and that they all conform to what people in the education department, for instance, at the centralised one, the Department of Education, New Zealand Department of Education, reaction against what some people there wanted, what some people in government wanted. So gradually you had a turning against it. Even from within government circles, there was a reaction.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because, fast forward to the present day, and we might think of, in some ways, something similar playing out in as much as the Ministry of Education has a certain ideological take on how the curriculum ought to be. And we'll come back to that later in our discussion. But one might then wonder the same thing, whether schools will implement that in quite the way the ministry hopes they will or thinks they will. And I suppose it's always with us, isn't it? If you've got a central authority who are setting an agenda like a school curriculum that has to be implemented by, well, in our case, thousands of schools around the country.
Yes, I certainly hope so. I'm sort of less optimistic now because bureaucracy is much more pervasive than it was at the time in many ways, particularly in the secondary schools. One time in secondary schools, going back to the era of when I did my thesis, looking at interwar period, secondary schools for a long time did much as they wanted.
Right.
But now, of course, the pressure is on, and when we had the Picot report, Tomorrow's Schools, you've taken away that middle tier, the education department, the education boards. That was the middle tier in the administration. Very often they could actually hold up the department in many ways, and they would have held up the ministry, but they got rid of them.
I see. But on the other side of it, if you look at the 2007 curriculum, as I'm sure you have,
Yes.
there isn't a great deal in it, really.
No.
And
No.
that seems to me, I certainly have some problems with that, because I think that teachers need a lot more support in terms of what to teach and how to sequence things and so on. But one thing that does do is give schools a fairly free hand about what to teach, because if the curriculum doesn't really tell you, then, there's a great deal of latitude there. One might reflect that in the final 3 years, the exam system or the assessment system, which isn't all exams now, of course, acts as a de facto curriculum in the absence of a more detailed national curriculum. But apart from that, it seems to me schools have a fairly free hand.
Yes, I actually was engaged in an examination of a thesis which was about Muslim schools, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the points that she made is that it might pay to have more direction in terms of the sorts of values of democracy and equality, because some of the schools, particularly after the shootings in Christchurch, the impact, for instance, of the Prime Minister wearing a head covering in sympathy actually had the opposite effect on Muslim schools. They became far more conservative.
Oh, really?
Very conservative. So female staff members were obliged to wear coverings and so on.
I see. Yeah.
So it became less so. And one of the points I think she made in this thesis was that maybe you do need more direction from the centre regarding democracy and the values that we supposedly espouse.
It's interesting you mentioned that. James and I have just finished working on a chapter for a book which Elizabeth Rata is editing on this topic of education for democracy. And one of the things that came across in some of the reading for that is that actually teaching children civics doesn't seem to make much difference to their later participation in democracy.
Yeah, there's actually a report from the initiative by Eric Crampton, I think, which looks at that. Well, it's actually part of the Democracy in the Dark report, which does a short survey of New Zealanders and finds out that they don't know as much as you might think about civics. Yeah, and then it surveys some research, mainly from the United States, about civics. And in the United States, there's a similar problem that if you poll people, they end up not knowing much. And that's the case whether you have a civics program in your state or not. So it's kind of a hard problem of informing the citizenry properly in education.
Yeah, absolutely.
We wrote this chapter with a recent PhD graduate from Victoria University, Baptiste Ricard. He's a French man, and his particular focus is on philosophy for children and what he calls the argumentative theory of reasoning. And so his thrust is towards getting children to participate in debate and discussion so that they learn in many ways the practice of democracy as opposed to just about our government system. Yes. And so on. And that seems to me likely to be a more successful approach, because if you take the view as I do, and I think James does, that a contest of ideas is at the root of democracy, it's the most important thing, and that the institutions flow from that rather than the institutions themselves being what defines democracy, then having children inculcated in the practice of argument and reasoning seems to be a good way ahead, perhaps.
Yes. Interestingly enough, when I joined a Department of Education at Massey, I'd come from a historical background where when we started history in the university, it was all about debate. It was medieval history, and we had to not only study the period, but look at the way historians had dealt with it. Was there a Middle Ages, And we learned debate very, very early on. It was all about debate. But when I went into to education, I found that very often there wasn't a debate. It was almost like, if you can imagine having a script where people are debating things, and it's like somebody's got a ruler or something underneath each line, and so everybody follows that line, and then maybe 10 years later you'll get a response and a reaction, but there's very little debate at the time, and it really concerned me that educators didn't quite see it the way historians did. They didn't see history the way historians did it, whereas historians saw debate and research as being a central part. The people that were talking about school history were not interested in that debate at all. What they wanted to is an outcome for children to be a certain sort of citizen. And that bothered me at the time.
Yes, I know what you mean. I was trained as a scientist, and like you, I went into an education school, and I found the same thing. To me, the thing that really nonplussed me was their apparent indifference to evidence as a source of argument or supporting an argument. It seemed to be a lot more ideological than evidence-based a lot of the time.
Yes, I remember when you have to go back to most of the universities in New Zealand. There was a little going on in the 70s, mainly 80s, when the new sociology began to take over. And it was the interesting thing, if you look at theses of the 80s and 90s, you will see they've got a distinct pattern. You'll get a very detailed discussion of prominent theorists like Antonio Gramsci or Bourdieu or whoever it is. And then they'll say, here is the way it plays out in New Zealand. But you could take away all the New Zealand so-called evidence that they had, which is very, very little.
Yes.
Just some official document vaguely quoted. You could actually take that away and just use the theory, because I always used to say, and many others have, the theory was the evidence and the evidence was the theory.
Yes, it's all a bit of a tight circle, isn't it?
Very much.
Much of the time.
Did they control for sort of motivated reasoning at all? Because it seems to me that it's a fairly well-established psychological principle or tendency now that if you approach evidence with a certain framework in mind, everyone seems to have a tendency to try and fit the evidence to that theory. So how did they deal with that?
Well, as I said, they just fitted the evidence to the theory. That's why I mentioned the theory is the evidence is the theory. And they would just pick quotes that seemed to actually fit the theory. And for historians, that starting with the theory is almost the wrong way to do it, because we used to maybe cast around our net wider after we'd got the evidence. So it was a different way of working. I know not all sociologists work that way. I mean, I got to work with Elizabeth Rata, and I think we engaged in dialogue all the time, but I think in some ways she was an exception.
She's in many ways an exception, is Elizabeth. Yes.
I just read a review of one of your books, and it seemed to me that the reviewer was sort of lambasting you for not employing a particular framework. In this case, it was a neo-Marxist framework.
Absolutely.
And it just struck me as kind of curious, especially because Marxism itself is quite a fringe theory in society at large, and in terms of its academic status, I mean, I know that in economics, for example, the Marxist labor theory of value, that's now seen as just something that people used to think in the old days, and most economists now think that it's really supply and demand that establishes price. So it's just a bit strange to see you being lambasted for not using a theory which doesn't seem especially well-grounded or especially respected within the sort of harder social sciences.
It was exactly that way, and that's what happened when you raised these questions. I remember raising a question in several meetings about theory. You know, is it really the cast iron theories that you really think? Because I can remember reading a book which I actually contributed to, it's a while ago now, where the editors turned around and said, now we have the correct theory, we don't need any more. You know, all we've got to do is show how that works out in New Zealand. And I kept on saying, but Antonio Gramsci was actually Italian, and he actually died in, 1937. He would have been a very different theorist had he been writing or survived into the 1950s and seeing what happened. And it didn't. It was almost like the theory was it, and if you criticised it, the evidence was almost like the response was a little bit like a fundamentalist Christian. Hope none of you are fundamentalist Christians, but they would say, "Have you read the Bible? Have you read what some disciple wrote?"
Marcuse or someone like that.
Yeah, have to be. That would be the thing. Have you really looked at what Gramsci said? Have you looked at what Bourdieu wrote? Have you looked at what Bourdon said? And you've said this, so you must be wrong.
Strange, isn't it? It took me about 4 years to realise that the way educationalists or educational sociologists in particular use the word theory had absolutely nothing to do with the way I used it as a scientist.
No.
It's almost a diametrically opposite thing. As you say, it seems to be that the theory is itself the basis for argument, as if it was evidence on its own.
Yes, absolutely.
Whereas, of course, in science, and it's going to be different again in history, but in science, you have a theory that from which you derive hypotheses that are empirically testable, and then you test them. And to the extent that the hypotheses are not falsified by your experiment, your theory gains a little bit of explanatory validity. But nobody is ever saying the theory is true, let alone that it should stand without empirical basis. Now, in history, it seems, I think you were saying that it's more an exercise in building up the theory from evidence over time, which is that did I take you correctly there? Or?
Well, historians very, very, very much greatly, as I said there, they tend to be very eclectic in their, not in evidence, but in terms of the way they look at theory. They're certainly very critical of it. So the historians will continuously say, well, if you have a look at a current theory, it doesn't work out quite that way. I'll give you a good example of that from my own work, and that was trying to understand one of the theorists, I think it was Gramsci, I could be mistaken, that said, hegemonic. It's all hegemonic, you see. And so if the state says something, everybody sort of believes what they're saying. And there was this notion going around that governments of the day would put one over on rural communities. Mm-hmm. It wasn't what I found when I started to talk to people from rural communities. I can remember interviewing a particular, at the time he was chairman of the school committees around New Zealand, and he looked at me with a grin and he said, we knew what they were trying to do. He said, anybody could have seen through what was happening, and what we did is turn it to our advantage. This was during just after tomorrow's schools. And it struck me at the time that if you look at New Zealand's rural community, they're actually very well educated, very well educated indeed.
And quite independent-minded, it sounds.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so there was a great deal of difference between that and, say, somebody studying peasants in Brazil or southern Italy, where 80% of the population, the rural population, was illiterate at the time. Of course, they will react differently to something. But New Zealand rural areas have always been very, very independent-minded. For instance, during the 1920s, there was an attempt from the Department of Education to say, why can't we have an intelligence test? Why can't we test everybody? And then write maybe letters to parents saying, don't have children, because your intelligence isn't quite as much. And the rural areas responded absolutely vociferously. And governments did too. That's absolutely disgraceful. You're telling us we're less intelligent than people in the towns. Where's the evidence? And authorities backed away. I must say the government was pretty concerned too. At the time, it was very heavily rural based. They were most incensed when the bill came up. Never got passed by Parliament. It was just thrown out.
Yeah.
So it's very different, and it just struck me that things are very different when you're looking at the way people are so-called indoctrinated, because they do react to these things.
Yes, some of these grand theories of history, the kind of Marxist views and so on, seem to posit people as being a bit passive or a bit incapable of drawing their own conclusions or standing up to power or
yes,
and so on. But this question of evidence actually provides quite a nice segue into something I'd like to ask you about, which is the curriculum, the history of curricula in New Zealand. Now, of course, the current New Zealand curriculum was implemented in 2007, and it seems to me that it has a fairly thin evidence base behind it. It looked to me, and tell me what you think about this, it looked to me as if it was fairly firmly based on some thinking out of the New Zealand Council of Education research to do with what they call 21st century learning.
Yes.
The idea that we can do away with disciplines, or at least boundaries between disciplines, and that the knowledge that children need to be taught should be looked at pretty pragmatically in terms of what we think is going to be required in the decades ahead, and somehow that's going to be not much to do with the kind of knowledge that we've valued in the past.
Yes, absolutely. I've always been interested in looking at some of the original ideas. If you're looking, for instance, at progressivism or progressive thinking, so-called the progressive movement, many of those early progressives would have been horrified actually by by 2007 if they looked at a New Zealand document.
At the new curriculum. Why is that? What do you think would have horrified them?
Well, I think what would have horrified them is exactly what you've said. Many of the early progressives, if you're looking at American ones, were not...
People like
they were pretty upset. I don't know. I'm using the term progressive very liberally here and widely, so people have written books about it. But if you look at somebody like in the new maths, Jerome Bruner, the great American, who's behind the new mathematics.
Yeah.
If you ever heard any of his lectures, and some of them were recorded, and seen the way he thinks, it was absolutely not let the children do whatever they want, or there's no we adults can't teach you anything. Not at all. His very much was quite structured actually, and yes, there's some discovery learning in it, but it meant something very different from what it later became in the Ministry of Education. So I've always been interested in how an original theory has shifted, education theories anyway, within a bureaucracy. That's a fascinating era.
Yes, and this idea of, you mentioned discovery learning. Now they might call it child-centered learning or child-led learning. Yes. And again, tell me your views on this, because it's something I've thought about to some extent, but I'm not the expert that you are by any means. But it seems to me to come from a kind of neo-Rousseauianism. If we think of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the French philosopher from 17th, 18th century, he had this view that people were born pretty much perfect, or with all of the things in them that they would need through their lives, and so really the educational process was about bringing that out of them rather than putting things in.
Yes.
Would you agree that that is the kind of philosophy that sits in the background of this child-centred kind of approach?
Yes, it is, but I think we'd have to distinguish very much between child-centred approaches and child-centred approaches, if you know what I mean.
Yes.
It depends how it's interpreted, for instance, by a bureaucracy or whatever. I'm interested very much in how it can be taken, to, I guess, to a different level, or even an extreme, when bureaucracies get into it. And I can remember looking at the debates. Some of us, my colleagues, were looking at it at the moment. The beginnings of the examination system that we have now, or not the examination system, but the assessment
The
regime that
NCEA,
we
you
have,
mean?
NCEA, and where it came from. And it panned out in New Zealand very differently from the originals, which were from Europe and particularly from Scotland.
The Scottish Vocational Education Board, I think, or ScotVec.
Yeah, ScotVec. And McCall was the name that springs to mind. He came over to New Zealand. But in Scotland, they actually kept an academic stream. They had two, in a sense, and they used it somewhat differently. But in New Zealand, the department, I remember finding in departmental files a book by Benjamin Glasser, the American writer. Benjamin Glasser wrote a book called Schools Without Failure. This is the notion that some children leave school failures, right? Feeling failures. We don't want that, because that's bad for them, right? We want them to feel good about themselves. So we blur things so that nobody leaves school a failure. And it was picked up, I think, by some people within the department and changed. So what happened, and of course Russell Marshall was Minister of Ed at the time.
This was under the Longy government.
Yeah, under the Longy government. But it started to blur all the distinctions. So instead of having grades from A to E or whatever it is, and your comments. So let's say if you don't score terribly highly, or it doesn't look like you're scoring terribly highly, well, why not call that achieved? So people they weren't going to feel bad about themselves.
Actually, the way they designed NCEA in the first place, and it got renegotiated because a lot of schools didn't like it, was, as you say, to have no fail grade at all, and to have only one passing grade.
Yep.
So eventually, many of the schools started to react against that, and that's when they invented merit and excellence, so there was some gradation of performance. But the original idea was that nobody would ever know you'd attempted something unless you passed, and if you'd passed, then all you would get was achieved, and that was it.
Yeah, that's it. Yep. Yeah, yes, very much. And so it went through one comment I can remember reading, and it was from one of the senior Labour cabinet ministers at the time. And he pointed out, well, the trouble is if we take this to extremes, what will happen is that employers who originally actually were quite in favour of NCEA would start to, I mean, how do you judge two people if you've got two people going for the job? What they'll do is end up reverting to the system we used to have, a century ago. What colour's your school tie? Where did you come from? Which school did you come from?
Well, the other thing that happened
and that's a shame.
Early in the NCEA was that in order to distinguish themselves, bright students would simply do an enormous number of standards and accumulate massive numbers of credits. So the lack of ability to distinguish themselves in grades manifested as taking on a huge volume of work instead.
Yes.
I saw that in the data when I was working at NZQA. But to come back to the curriculum, now, of course, the government is reviewing or refreshing the curriculum, as they say, and there are a few things that are starting to emerge from that process that would be interesting to talk to you about. One of them of course, is the New Zealand Histories curriculum, and I'm sure you as an historian
Yes.
and as an educationalist have some firm views on how that's going.
Well, I've read some of the submissions that you can get, and I know Paul Moon's probably been able to get a lot more of those submissions. Some of the things that struck me as a historian looking at it, and I know others have mentioned this, is that the first thing is that it's almost as if the cart's come before the horse. So it's almost as if somebody is saying, if you read that curriculum, here is the point of view that we want you to come to. And here's a little bit of evidence that might help you come to that conclusion. And in fact, if you look at the evidence that they're presenting and the views that they're presenting, there's only one view you can come to, and that's colonialism as a thorough evil.
Yep.
Certainly British colonialism or Western colonialism is a thorough evil all the way. It is bad, that's it, unmitigated. I think since the days of Kosovo, since the days of Rwanda, and the terrible tragedies that occurred there, I think historians have started to look at colonialism, no matter whose colonialism it is, and it's a global phenomenon, and it's a human phenomenon. They're starting to look at it in a different way. It's a murky sort of area, like much of history. If you look at things, that the actual truth might lie somewhere. It's still debatable. It's very difficult to come to those firm
You were speaking
conclusions.
before about the kind of imperial motivations of the educational authorities in the 1920s and trying to inculcate this patriotism. And I mean, that was one ideological extreme, and now it seems we might be at another. But I'd be interested to bring James in here, who's also an historian, an ancient historian, with an interest in democracy and this idea of colonialism. I mean, it seems to me that it's been almost a universal throughout human history. If we go back to the ancient Greek city-states, and
that's right. I mean, I think at the base of it, it's just a desire to sort of get more stuff and to dominate others to get more stuff, whether that be land or women. That's happens in early human history, and actually in some of our nearest ancestors as well, like chimpanzees. I believe they have a form of warfare to get females. So it's sort of a dark part of human nature, and it's one that we've sort of gotten better at handling, but it's always there, this desire to conquer. And the societies which haven't had any desire to defend themselves or to expand are few and far between, partly because, it's pretty obvious what happens if there are all these societies out there trying to expand and to conquer, and you decide that you're not going to play that game. You have to be on a very remote island, and even if you are on a very remote couple of islands like the Chathams, you might be conquered by other people, and this is, of course, what happened to the Moriori.
Yeah, absolutely.
In New Zealand. But you could make similar points about slavery. That's also something that nowadays we hear a lot about in the context of the Brits and the Americans, who are obviously in the United States. There was a chattel slave system, and the Brits were very involved in transatlantic slavery. But it's often forgotten that Britain was the first civilization to ban slavery, and it was going against the grain even in the 19th century. And the United States, of course, fought a huge war with lots of casualties involving lots of white northerners in order to end slavery. And then, of course, you have to also talk about all the societies in the ancient world and the medieval world that had slavery, including, of course, Islam. And there used to be a tendency within ancient history, associated especially with Moses Finley, to say Greece and Rome were slave states, but actually the states of the Near East, we can't really call them properly slave states. And this was sort of a technical Marxist definition of the term. But recently there's been this book by David Lewis at the University of Edinburgh, which just reviews all the evidence for slavery in Near Eastern civilizations. And it's very large. And he basically makes the point, there's no reason why we shouldn't call this slavery as well. So anyway, just everywhere we look in history, ancient world, modern world, until very recently there was slavery, and yet we only really seem to talk about slavery in British and American civilization.
Yeah, well, I think we sometimes forget that many of the people involved in slavery were on the African continent anyway. I mean, those slave routes have been known since ancient times. Many of actually, if you look down the West African coast, many of those cities were actually built on slavery. They operated before the British or any Europeans ever got there. That's how they survived, in fact. Then slavers relied on those slave routes. But with British colonialism, for instance, I always understood from our own work was done and my own lectures that we used to receive and tutorials that Britain actually wasn't terribly interested in colonies for many years. It really wasn't until the 1880s they began to see colonies as worth having. Their experience from the American War of Independence, which was colonies weren't worth having. Frankly, they didn't want anything to do with them.
Although they had India by then, didn't they?
Yes, they did, but it was a private. That was a private company.
But there was Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, and
yeah, that's right.
Others.
We should probably get Matthew Birchill, our other colleague, who has a PhD in Imperial and Commonwealth history, in the room. But yeah, no, I mean it's my understanding that there, with several of the European imperial states in the 19th century, early 20th century, there's a shift from this kind of company-based exploitation, I suppose you could call it.
Yep.
Often quite armed, though. These companies did often have these private armies, but there's a shift at some stage from that to what you see in India, for example, with the Raj, which is sort of more formal annexation.
Yeah, I see.
But that does happen later than some people.
Very much later, and attitudes change. Certainly, the annexation of New Zealand. There were a lot of people in government that weren't terribly happy about doing it at all because, it's not worth anything. I mean, New Zealand. I mean, somebody actually mentioned me. Oh, they had iron sand. No, nobody was interested in it because they had plenty of. They could get it themselves. Well, even with things like spars in the early days. I mean, I wouldn't have thought you'd put a Kauri spar in a warship.
Yeah, no, I think that early on it was very difficult for people to see the future value of these places. I mean, notoriously, Alaska was sold for 2 cents an acre.
Yeah.
And you could say the same about the Louisiana purchase. The French, obviously, at the time just thought, what's up with this? Why bother to hold on to this stuff? There's nothing there.
Yeah, it was. People looked at it rather differently than what they did, say, in the later part of the 19th century. But even people like Gladstone were saying they were anti-imperialist.
Right.
It's one of the reasons they didn't get involved in the Sudan until much later. It was only pressure from the public that brought them in finally.
To bring things back to the New Zealand History's curriculum itself a bit, so we could sort of look at this discussion we've been having and see that colonialism is a complex phenomenon.
It's complex.
James has mentioned that there's some things inherent in human nature that are even shared by chimpanzees that make it a fairly inevitable practice throughout history, and certainly it's sometimes been violent and bloody and has involved slavery. On the other hand, it's often developed people. We think of the Roman Empire and how it brought structure to Europe, and similarly the British Empire brought technology and other benefits to many parts of the world, even though it also displaced people and disenfranchised them. So it is a complex phenomenon. But I think what you're saying, Roger, is that the New Zealand History's curriculum portrays only one lens, which is the oppressive side of colonialism.
Yeah, very much. And not all Maori lost. Some gained a lot. It depended who you were. And that's true of all colonialism, I would have thought. It depended who you were. If you look at Roman colonialism, I would have thought that a lot of people in Britain actually gained. Not everybody lost.
Right.
Depended what you did, who you sided with. And very often that changed too. So, I was concerned about that. I'm also concerned about, and I know others have mentioned this, the notion of the state, which is very neo-Marxist again. When you look at that curriculum, they'll always talk about the state. The state did this, the state did that. Yes, but governments do it, not states. Governments are different governments.
Yes.
One government doesn't have the same policy as the next one. And so talking about the state in that way is very much of a Marxist thing, I think, and very, very strongly sort of Eastern European, So you can talk about the state if you're behind the Iron Curtain.
Yes, yeah.
But it's a bit hard to talk about that if you're talking about democracies because governments change.
And of course, the New Zealand History's curriculum is now about to be put in place. I think they're starting to teach it next year. Is that right? And
this year, I think.
This year, so it's already starting to be rolled out in our schools. And I'm interested in how you think that will go, based on your knowledge of the past as much as anything. When these initiatives get put in place what will teachers do with them?
Well, I think they find it very difficult. I mean, what are you supposed to do? Stand up there and apologise somehow? You get that apologetic thing. And I think what will happen is many kids will just switch off completely, as indeed they did with the patriotic stuff in the 20s.
So
the kids switch off.
I guess kids maybe have an instinct about when someone's trying to indoctrinate them, or as opposed to educate them, and react accordingly.
And it only takes one teacher, I guess, like everything else. One of my colleagues once said about trying to put sex education to schools. You only need one teacher to sort of line kids up and say, hang your heads in shame, you're all colonialists. And the public's going to react very strongly, I would imagine. Not saying that'll happen, but...
I wonder, from what you were saying earlier, though, it sounds like you're kind of skeptical of the power of the state to impose its dogma in a way. Like you were saying that they tried to sort of impose this patriotism, but people in rural New Zealand, a lot of them could just do what they wanted. So does that make you a little bit more sanguine? Because I see you're sort of smiling through this conversation. So are you thinking, well, they're going to try and impose, the latest version of the dogma of the day, but actually, kids at school are just going to think what they want to think, and teachers are going to teach what they want to teach? Or are you more worried than that?
I think a system is more efficient in a way than it used to be, in the sense that we're given the new structures in education. We've got to tomorrow's schools. It's much more, there's nothing much between the Ministry of Education and the school.
I would say, though, that I think that many schools are extremely sceptical of the ministry and its pronouncements. And perhaps, while you're right, there are no longer education boards insulating them. I wonder if the schools themselves will do their own thinking along different lines, and will end up with many different manifestations of the New Zealand History's curriculum.
Yes, I suspect that will be the case. I suspect that's going to be the case. But one of the difficulties is you put kids off history completely.
Well, that maybe is something that schools have done a lot in many different subjects, depending on the teacher you happen to have had.
Yes.
Can I ask, so do you see any good in this curriculum? Because, I mean, I've been in New Zealand for 10 years now, but not longer than that. And I sometimes hear, even from critics of the new curriculum, that, we do need a little bit more Maori history. In the past, there wasn't so much. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, we do. I happen to be in, I think, the first course in New Zealand run by Professor Oliver at Massey. And it was a course in New Zealand history, very much an experiment, because colleagues looked at him and said, but there isn't any material. What are you going to do for the whole year? And you've got a whole year's course in it, And we found quite a lot. We all did theses in New Zealand history. This is going back to the early 70s. Because, and if you have a look at teaching, for instance, a lot of the educational history that came out was taught by methods people. So it was really an acts and facts thing, and put an awful lot of people off history for good that later went out and taught in schools.
So another aspect of the curriculum refresh is to infuse Mataranga Māori or traditional Māori knowledge through all the different subjects and disciplines. And one area where that's certainly raised some controversy that many listeners will already be familiar with is in the science curriculum. Now, we've discussed Elizabeth Rata, and she and several other professors from Auckland wrote a now, I would say, almost infamous letter to the listener a year and a half ago, saying that really this was going to be a problem because, I mean, I'm paraphrasing them here, but science and Mataranga Māori have very different epistemic bases. They're not the same way of thinking about knowledge or the same way of testing knowledge. And that seemed to me at the time to be a fairly obvious thing to say, and yet it raised a hue and cry. And
exactly.
And there were, several of them were investigated by the Royal Society. We needn't go through all the litany of what happened because I think our listeners will be fairly familiar with it. But I'm interested in your reflections on this process and exactly what was taking place there in terms of a cultural moment.
Well, coming back to what James is saying about, I had a smile on my face. in a way, it's guaranteed to wipe that smile off my face, because one of the things that is going on is the condemnatory aspect, and that is very strong in the education system. So if you stand out against this in any way, and even in the universities, you are going to get clobbered. You really will be.
It's not great for the spirit of scholarship, is it?
No, it is not. And it's a shame, because I've talked to some of my colleagues. I remember talking to one colleague who shall be nameless, nice guy too, great, been colleagues for years, and said something. I got hustled out the building, right out the building, right outside. Now we can talk freely. Now we can talk freely. I was reminded of that great moment in the film. It was The Third Man, I think, Harry Lime, set in post-war Vienna, early post-war Vienna, and they're huddling together, saying what they really think about the Russian occupation, you see, and there's a car following them, you see, and they're huddled together, and you huddle together and saying what you really think, and the accent comes with it, the walls have ears, I'm not saying we're getting quite to that stage, but it really worries me that when you talk to colleagues about it, if you're in the building, say, they don't want to talk about it. They don't want to talk about it. No, it's look around and, somebody might be listening.
It's a really striking image that you actually had to step outside of a university building, because you might assume that actually the university is a place where free thought can occur. Well, actually it's the place par excellence where free thought should occur. But actually now we have to step outside the building. And I would add to what you were saying that, sometimes you hear people say, I heard this and I thought this, and, maybe social scientists will say, well, that's just an anecdote. But it's supported now by quite a lot of evidence. For example, the Free Speech Union did a survey of New Zealand academics, and over half of them said that they felt more constrained than free on a range of topics, but in particular discussing the Treaty of Waitangi, which is a major bit of New Zealand's history. So more than half of academics feel more constrained than free to discuss a major aspect of New Zealand's history. To me, that sounds quite
well.
worrying.
I talked to, I won't mention his name because he might be worried, but he looked at me, actually handed me some material on the Treaty of Waitangi and said, I'm going to talk about this in an international conference. But he said, have a look at it, but in no account mention my name. No account. He said, this is, and he was an expert in Pacific history, and he said, just don't mention my name. I just don't want it out there. Yeah. And that's, I guess, a counter-argument to what we were saying earlier, that maybe teachers and kids will do whatever they like in this thing, because within the education system, at the moment, it would be very difficult to stand out against this. I mean, I did the Tiko Tahitanga review. I did it for PPTA. And
so this is an initiative that started about 15 years ago.
Yeah, about 15 years ago.
Russell Bishop and Mary Berryman in particular, and the idea was that if we infused a kind of Māori worldview into schools, then that would not only help Māori students, but in fact all students. I remember Russell talking about that. Yeah,
I can remember talking to one lady, and she was wearing dark glasses at the time. She was crying. She'd been crying, and she'd been an assistant principal, and she only raised a couple of minor objections about the program. She thought it fell short in a couple of areas. She was told to get out, and she did. She now works privately in something, I can't remember what. I won't mention her name. Another teacher who I remember interviewed, and he said, yes, I was pushed into the program. I didn't want to, you see, but I was told to do it, and I did it for the year, and the results weren't terribly good. And I was really put on the carpet. I had to write a 2-page essay on why I'd failed and about my racism. And I said, well, it must have been a terrible experience. And he said, yes, it was. And I said, what did you do next year? And he grinned at me. He said, I picked my Maori students, and boy, did I pick the best. He said, this group of Maori students could have succeeded if I'd have been teaching it in Chinese, because they were superb students. And he said, yes, I achieved a much better result the second time over. And that's, of course, what teachers used to do in payment by results back in the 19th century, pick their students.
It's not great for the students who don't get picked, though, is it? But no, I mean, you raise an important point here, which is that the whole Te Ao Maori thing, the Maori world and traditions and history, I find that personally very interesting. And I don't necessarily have an objection about teaching that to students.
No,
I actually, not only do I not have objections, I can see why that would be a great thing in New Zealand because it's part of
Yeah.
New Zealand's culture.
Yep.
Then you often hear this more specific claim that Maori students' results will improve if you adopt this Maori worldview, if you infuse a Maori worldview into schools. And you gentlemen would know better than me, but what's the evidence base like for that? Because it does strike me that there is evidence for other propositions, such as that a lot of the effect of Maori underperforming at schools and university has to do with a lot of them being drawn from lower socioeconomic groups, and it's much more difficult for obvious reasons to get ahead.
There is some good evidence on that, or some reasonable evidence.
Roy Nash springs to mind as the scholar that has really done a lot in that field. He wrote a couple of books where he did a lot of extensive research. And I think one of the remarks he made to me is that when they asked him about attitudes towards teachers. This was during the time of the Tiko Tahitanga debate and so on. Not much debate, actually. And he said that it was just when he asked people how they viewed their teachers, Maori students actually had a slightly more positive view of teachers than the rest.
That's interesting.
It wasn't statistically significant, but it was a slight difference in favour.
Well, there is some statistical evidence that I'm aware of that is in favour of the hypothesis that you just mentioned, James, which is that really Māori and Pacifica underachievement is really not to do with anything racist, but rather poverty. And that is the new equity index,
Yes.
which is a new way of funding schools according to the proportion of their kids who are living in poverty. And so this is a statistical model that they put together to predict the probability of getting NCEA level 2 based on a whole lot of socioeconomic variables. And so they built this model, and having built the model and accounted for a lot of variance in that probability, they put in an ethnic flag as well, so that the statistical model would take into account if a child was Māori or Pacifica. And they found that it explained no extra variance in the probability of getting level 2 NCEA after all the socioeconomic variables had been accounted for. And that tends to suggest that it really is basically socioeconomic. Now, none of this is to rule out the possibility that racism sometimes plays a part, or racist assumptions about what children are capable of. I think it would be naive to deny that was present.
Well, when I did the TK review, one of the things that came out of that was, if you have a look at those 3 documents that they produced on TK, they very much came down on the fact that the teacher was the problem because of racism.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've heard of the Hun report. Came out in the early 50s, and that argued that the reason for Maori failure at school had a lot to do with socioeconomic factors. That was a new generation, particularly of sociologists and educators, that's turned that into a dirty word, the Hun report. You mention that and you're in trouble. It's bad. Blaming the victim, they would say.
Right.
And that's it.
Another thing about this that strikes me as a bit curious as a foreigner, as an outsider, is just that Mataranga Maori content that's often pushed it seems to me to be very much focused around what you call the sort of traditional Te Ao Maori life ways, myths, Papatuanuku, Maui, things like that. Again, beautiful, very interesting myths. And similarly with Pacifica, but then if you travel a bit in the Pacific, people in Tonga and Samoa are often heavily Christian, devoutly Christian. And so I just wonder often, so if the idea is we're going to make these people feel more comfortable by inserting traditional Polynesian myths, it seems to sort of get the target a bit wrong, because often these people are quite modern in various ways.
Well, it seems to make assumptions about what people will be like based on their ethnicity, which may be one definition of racist.
Yes, well, it came back to a thesis I recently had the honour to examine, and that was being suggested there. One of the things that the lady that did the thesis pointed out from her study of schools in Auckland was that teachers, presumably influenced by Ministry of Education material and so on, were seeing the important thing was to identify the student's ethnicity and then talk about, and that depended then, once you determined the ethnicity, that determined the sorts of knowledge they were going to have access to. And I stuck in my mind one of the examples she used of these Asian students who were Asian children, I think primary or intermediate school, can't remember which, but the teacher, well-meaning, said, from Vietnam or wherever you were from, so we're going to talk about your dances and your songs and your culture and so on, because you don't want sort of Western stuff. And they came to her finally and said, well, look, the reason parents came to this country is because we want knowledge, we want science, and we want maths, and we want these things.
And I often reflect that actually the best reason to send children to school is to take them out of what they get from their home backgrounds, because of course they'll get that from their home backgrounds. I think Elizabeth Rutter makes this point quite often. The point of teaching the disciplines is to point them in the direction of things that transcend what they would get from their communities and their families. But instead, the current philosophy seems to be, let's just give them more of that.
Yes, very much. It comes back to the child-centred thing, and I don't think some of the early progressives would have agreed with that at all.
No, some of the modern I think of Michael F.D. Young, for example,
different,
who speaks very strongly in favour of teaching what he calls powerful knowledge.
Yes, absolutely.
So that children are able to transcend things that might hold them back if they are left to just what they'll get from their backgrounds.
Yeah, it comes down to what I'm really interested in, looking at how a bureaucracy takes an idea, an educational bureaucracy, and how they use that idea but change it as they go, so that it perhaps doesn't quite resemble the original at all.
Yes, they turn powerful knowledge into what they call big ideas.
Yes, that's right. And
which is a little more of an impoverished thing.
Big idea sounds kind of cool to me. But
it does sound kind of cool, but when you look up what they think the big ideas are in each subject, you're left scratching your head as to what the subject is really about very often.
So your argument is that it's often too general.
Well, I would say that it doesn't take into account, as the notion of powerful knowledge does, the structure of a discipline and how it makes its inquiries and why it's different from another discipline and what its epistemic basis is, its basis in theories of knowledge. So it tends to be more sort of slogans. And anyhow, we're coming up to an hour here, Roger, and there's one thing that I'd just like to ask you more generally before we finish, which is what needs to change in New Zealand education? If you look at the sort of broad sweep of the last 100 years, as I know that you have in all of your work, where are we in terms of an historical trajectory, and what would your advice to modern policy makers be if they were prepared to listen?
So I don't think they are going to listen, not to historians. Historians would say, you never listen to us anyway.
That may be true, but let's just say we could get them to listen.
I think there are some problems coming up. Going to be a bit specific here, more than general, what I think should happen in education. But I got quite interested in use of karakia in schools, as you know. And one of the things I think that is going to come, I mean, it's always said, oh, well, that's okay, it's just culture. It's just culture, it's not religion at all.
So you're talking about the idea that New Zealand education ought to be secular.
Well, the trouble is with that notion is that you will end up getting people reacting. And what do? Let's say you get parents coming up and say, I don't want my child to do that. I don't want my child to. What do you do with them? So we're almost going back, I guess, to what, if you have a look at the New Zealand history curriculum again, go back to the 1920s and 30s, one of the things they did is that history was a subject they taught in the curriculum, but underneath history they had written, any parent that wishes to withdraw their children may do so.
Right.
Because the history taught tended to be English history, and it tended to be, the good Protestants and the bad Catholics, Elizabeth I and all that. And many people here are Catholic, and so that particular issues has died very largely. But maybe you're going to get the same sort of debate going on here eventually, particularly if it becomes an election issue, as it might, as part of general feeling that the history curriculum has gone a little bit askew and so on. So, I wonder what that will lead to in terms of what's voluntary and what's going to be compulsory. Because the history curriculum is compulsory.
Yes.
Be made compulsory. What should be compulsory and voluntary?
I suppose that question starts to arise once the curriculum starts to prescribe content.
Yeah.
Now, my view is that it should prescribe content much more than the 2007 curriculum did. So when I heard about the history curriculum being put together, I was quite happy. I thought this is a move in the right direction. But then, of course, we find out what the content is, and it looks less like the discipline of history and more like an ideological take on it. And from this conversation, Roger, I've got the impression that in the teaching of history, ideology has always been present in some way or another, whether that was the sort of imperialist history of the earlier 20th century or this kind of Catholic against Protestant thing of the mid-20th century, or now the extreme anti-colonialist view of the New Zealand history's curriculum.
Yeah, my worry, I guess, when you look at it, is that I draw a sharp distinction between history as it's taught or as scholars do history and school history, which is very different, because school history, it seems to me, always wants an outcome from children. We're doing this because we want to turn the children into better citizens believing in X, Y, and Z. Whereas historians who are writing about any particular period are not really wanting to do that, or it sometimes comes out. There are certainly debates over that sort of thing, but it's much more fluid. People are discussing evidence and coming back to your question of evidence and debate. New Zealand history has been an area for debate. That's good. I think that's great to have debate, because that shows you the field is something worth looking at. Because people are debating things, debate things in science too, and that's good. Surely it's not. I remember talking with somebody in social studies, and they said, we're a bit worried about your writing, because you're making social studies into a contentious area. We don't want any sign that we are dissenting from each other. And I said, well, that surely is a mark of a mature field, that you're having debate. But in school history, it seems to me that very often there isn't debate, or when it does take place, not taking place in education, taking place elsewhere. That's a shame.
We could come back to what we were talking about before with Baptiste's work on having children practice debate and contesting ideas, and maybe then we would be able to have a more mature approach to history and science and social studies and all of these fields, where, of course, it seems obvious to any scholar that the point of the discipline is to contest ideas within an epistemic framework, and if it isn't, then it's just ideology. Right?
Philosophy for Children, you're aware of that program in New Zealand? Philosophy for Children.
Exactly.
It's a very good one.
That was what Baptiste was working within. That's
right. I had a colleague that was very interested in philosophy for children at Massey, and that was very, very interesting, and I think it would be a really good place. We used to start some of our basic courses in education at Massey. We started with philosophy and debate. That's where we started. So we used Plato, for example, children of bronze, silver and gold. What do you think of? So you got people talking, and I did something on, it was a debate that took place in the 1950s over, again, what we've been talking about, indoctrination and so on in schools. And, there was a big reaction against one of the curricula of the day. But at least it was debated at that time, although not much in education. But well,
that's great. Yeah, so you were drawing on the Republic.
Yeah, it was
help
good
but
that
pick
we
up
did
your
that,
reference to that bit of the Republic. Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah.
And of course, Karl Popper in New Zealand wrote a book all about how Plato was anti-democratic, but it is true that if you look at the Platonic dialogues, the way that Socrates is portrayed really is, in my mind, a kind of ideal pedagogue. He really opens up the discussion. He wants to not only have people have their say, but he also wants to scrutinize what they say. So it's very kind of dialectical. But I actually think that, I'm in favor of content-rich curricula, but I also think that within my own lifetime, Anglo-Saxon education systems, so education systems in the English-speaking world, have actually been distinguished by leaving at least a little bit of space for the students to develop their own views through essays and such. Yes. And I think that's, from what I can tell, it's been a big difference between the education system in the United Kingdom and on the continent. Actually, we've got a new colleague here, Ben McIntyre, who went to high school and secondary school in France, and he echoes this as well. He says that when he was and a little bit in Auckland, and he says when he was in France, it was very much like you have to learn all this stuff by rote, which sometimes can be healthy, but it was just that. Then in New Zealand, it was more, okay, you've got to develop your own view, and maybe not enough content in the New Zealand system. But I think it would be a shame if we in English-speaking countries lost the freedom to debate and the emphasis on debate and scrutinizing each other's ideas.
You've got to do both, I think. You've got to get the content, because sometimes the debate doesn't make sense because no one knows what.
That's right. And actually,
you have nothing to talk about if you don't know anything. Right?
The discussion we've just had is an example of that. It's very difficult to, if I can put on my sort of ancient history hat now, it's very difficult to talk about subjects like slavery or colonialism in the abstract if you don't know anything about the history of slavery and colonialism. And it's almost equally hard if you only know about the slavery and colonialism of the British Empire, which, there was slavery and there was colonialism, but, it's very difficult to talk about that if you can't compare any other civilization.
Yeah, that's right. So I think I'd endorse your point about debate, actually, Michael. I think that's one of the things that's got to happen, and it's not happening as much. But we also don't neglect the content. So I think it's sort of having them both work together. And what I see in New Zealand education system is we've almost got neither.
Yes, well, here on Free Kiwis, we like both, and we're very glad to have had a chance to talk to you today, Roger, and we've had some good content and some good grist for debate out there. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Roger.